Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other week to discuss a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Well, whoops. We missed an episode there, mainly because, partly I think it was a mixture of travel and sickness and just insane schedules. But thank you, listeners, for bearing with us while we coped with sort of trying to get our. We were all set to record, and then I got stuck in traffic, and then Sarah got really sick.
We try not to enter into like the vaccine foray, but like get your flu vaccine because it's really bad if you get the flu.
The Mockingcast brought to you by the pharmaceutical industry yet again.
No, I had people being like, there's billboards around our town. They're like, "Remember me," and then it says like, "The flu, come get your shot."
She remembers you, girl. Okay, like the flu has not forgotten you. Yeah.
So you guys got
3 of the 4 of us got it. Yeah, I had 102 fever, which as an adult is most unpleasant. Yeah, it was
the body aches are the worst, man. Those are the worst.
And then just the weighty guilt of having not gotten anyone a flu vaccination, as the mother bearer of medical responsibility. So, yeah.
So you did not do no flu shots for you guys. That seems a little early, or maybe you got it in the early end.
And I'm just like a big fan of peppermint oil. Just kidding.
Rutger, what about you? Have you guys been healthy? Happy?
No, we were a little sick. I had just like a 20. No, neither healthy nor happy. I got a little bug like a week and a half ago, but it was I felt kind of crappy, and then went home and had a fever that night, and then I stayed home the next day just in case because I didn't want to get anyone else sick. But we've all gotten a little something, like nothing as dire as I think what Sarah got. But I mean, my youngest son spent 4 days home from school sick, which just was. My wife loves that. My wife just loves when
lives
the kids
for it. Yes.
Yeah, she needs a vacation after that. But no, we're generally doing okay. It is the insanity of the fall. Sort of the first real like ministry fall we've had since. The pandemic, and of course I'm like massively overfunctioning and trying to do everything, and I probably bit off. I said I bit off more than I can chew, but I'm just counting on the grace of Jesus to get me through. So there you go, and all good stuff. I mean, all good ministry stuff, but just too much, too much.
Too much when you're Rutger, Jan.
Yeah.
Hey, men. Well, I think that's like everywhere I go. I've been traveling so much for the book, and I just keep talking to people in church work, and it's like stewardship season,
season. Raise that cash.
And
which, Sarah, you don't really like. You don't have to do really. Do you? Do you send like fundraising letters to parents, or do you?
I do some of that, but that is a huge blessing in my ministry. Is that the diocese funds us, and so
amazing.
I know it is amazing. I mean,
see, that's what everyone thinks every church is like. They're like, don't you just get money from the diocese? It's like, no, we send money to the diocese so that Sarah doesn't have to do stewardship.
I mean,
that's what.
That's amazing, and thank you all so much for your contribution.
You're a missionary. We're funding your mission.
I don't think we could do 2 stewardship seasons in one household. I mean, so it is
that
like
is totally
God's
true.
grace
Yes,
that I'm not also like I
Yes.
do. I'm Josh and I are talking about his constantly, and so it's not like it's not in my brain. But every time we talk about it, RJ, I think, thank God I don't have to also do stewardship season right now. So,
how are your travels been, Dave? You've been everywhere.
Yeah.
You're jet setter.
Well, one thing we should mention we haven't really mentioned yet, but we got a Mockingbird conference in Tyler, Texas, coming up next. Sarah won't be there this year, but I will be there. That's October 28th and 29th, and if you're anywhere near that area of Texas, come on out. Jason Michelle will be there. Tish Warren will be there.
Cool.
Jason Thompson will be there. And it's just always I think we're doing a slightly different venue this time. So I can't wait for that. So it's not too late to come on out and see it. I've been traveling. I was just on the West Coast. I find that I love it. I really do enjoy it. I think it takes a toll at home, and being, I don't know, mid 40s now, I can feel it in my body a little bit more than I don't feel sick, but you just feel disoriented in a kind of a strange way. But I was talking about this before we got on, but one of the great pleasures, and it's honestly like moving beyond words, is everywhere I've gone on this tour, as opposed to the Seculosity, which we traveled around in 2019. I'm just meeting so many people to whom this podcast means so much, and it's taken me aback. It's deeply encouraging. It's also a little overwhelming because when people are crying and telling you that they couldn't have gotten through without this, or how much your grief has meant to people, or our friendship, or simply just the thread of grace in everyday life. I don't know. I'm trying not to make it into sort of a burden to carry or something like that, but we don't do this simply for giggles. It's nice to see that and to interact with people to whom the Mockingcast in particular has been a lifeline. We use those terms, we use those words, and if this were stewardship season for Mockingbird, which it's not, I would probably try to capitalize on that. But yeah, I could be a lot more tired than I am. And I think that's because there's so much wind in the sails from this project, in fact. So I'm sorry we missed an episode, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us.
Yeah, for sure.
I will say, you guys, even if it sounds weird to say, I'm so glad this means so much to so many people. But even if nobody were listening, I enjoy this time with you. It's so fun.
Same.
Like it's the highlight. Anytime it comes up, it's the highlight of my week. And I was bummed to miss an episode. And it's good. It's life-giving to me. So I'm grateful for the two of you, and I'm also grateful for the people who listen. It's kind of amazing.
You know what it makes me think of? And I was thinking of this when we were talking about it before we started recording, but I think it was the first. I mean, people should sign up for Tyler. Like, if you're in the area, like, it's so worth the drive. And I remember my first Tyler conference speaking at it, and there was just this row of Mockingbird guys. And I remember Dave was there. I remember my husband was there. Yeah, hardly. And and they're all sitting there. And I finished my talk, and I come down, and they're all weeping. And I thought, I'm always gonna be in this. Like, these are my people. And that's how this podcast feels for me. So I'm glad that it speaks to other people.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
I have to say, I've seen some stuff on social media recently which has been disturbing about kind of masculine Christianity, or feminine Christianity. But to me, like, that's masculine Christianity, like guys who have the freedom to, cry. Like, Jesus cries. Paul talks about remembering people with tears all the time. Like, David is hyper emotional. Like, there's nothing, you know what I mean? I love that.
And biblical. Yes.
Yes.
And Brian Wilson sings about male tears constantly.
And he's the most masculine person I can think of. That's right. That falsetto just really.
He's the straight man's Judy Garland.
Oh my God. That is a t-shirt.
Wow. Okay. You heard it here first.
Well, we got a lot to talk about today. We're going to pivot a little bit from what we were going to talk about 2 weeks ago. And the first thing, Sarah, this is I feel like this is directly aimed at all of us here, but just listen to this. This is in the New York Times. Michael Denzel Smith wrote an article called "Why Do People Think Going to Therapy Makes You a Good Person?" He talks about going back to therapy in his 40s after the pandemic. He says, "I can't say how much influence the way other people, especially on social media, talk about therapy had on my decision-making, but I'm sure it seeped in. There are armchair diagnoses of celebrities and other public figures happening in real time, alongside tweets admonishing people who display troubling behavior with the phrase, 'Go to therapy.'" Hashtag Sarah Connor.
I know.
There are detailed fantasies unfurled in long threads about what the world might look like if everyone went to therapy and worked out their issues. So by not going to therapy, I reasoned, I was failing not only myself, but a vision of a utopia that existed just on the other side of a therapist's couch. So I went. There is no official point at which we can say that therapy is destigmatized, and it may well continue to be looked down upon in some communities. Still, these efforts seem to be working. The list of celebrities opening up about their mental health issues grows by the day. But I've started to wonder if there's a flip side to this new openness, a new form of judgment that is broken down into a too simple binary. In therapy, good. Not in therapy, bad. This summer, the Times ran an article headlined, "Seeking Relationship, Therapy Required," about single people who insisted that their would-be partners be in therapy, who seemingly saw being in therapy as a signal for the kind of person they were looking for, the way someone might want a partner who votes in every election or buys organic.
Those people all want that. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's therapy, voting, organic is like all the same genre. Okay, keep going.
But
Someone
no physical
tweeted-
intimacy whatsoever.
Absolutely. We run a safe church household, okay? Are you trying to hug me?
The way you people use therapy to telegraph your feelings of moral superiority is corrupting our relationships and sucking the romance out of life, a tweet in response to the story said. In our conversations, therapists confirm the idea that people are going to therapy without a goal broader than working on themselves, and sometimes to show others that they are working on themselves. This, they said, can sometimes make sessions slightly confusing or rudderless. But the biggest issue, which therapists themselves told me, is that the fixation on therapy as the go-to cure-all leaves little room for people seeking other forms of healing. Therapy, for all it can help with, is mostly an individual practice. The focus is on the self and the relationship to the self, even though the self, too, is informed by outside forces. Therapy can offer a pathway toward understanding, but it can also overshadow the idea of healing in community. A lot there. I'm definitely on the train of therapy as sort of almost like a universal good.
Yeah.
Though I suppose that a really bad therapist can do damage, just like a really bad church or bad minister. But it is so difficult to live in the world as a person that I think anything you can do that helps, and I think therapy is genuinely helpful, just in hearing yourself talk and being listened to and that gracious act of that. I'm a person who basically thinks that it's almost good in all cases, but I also recognize in myself very much that something good like this can become a weapon or a tool of judgment, basically. I go to this thing because I need it. I need help. I'm admitting that I'm not complete. My low anthropology is driving me there, and yet it can become a tool of self-justification, just like anything else. And how sad is that, I guess? But what are y'all's responses to the article?
Well, this is a really heavy thing, but it's one of those things that I can't not say it. I was talking to a friend recently who works in mental health, and she was telling me about a kid she knew from a family that the kid wasn't in therapy, wasn't getting help, and was a 12-year-old, and they died by suicide. They took their own life, and it was really jarring. But my friend said something so interesting. She said, you know, it's so good that there's so much of a conversation about mental health, but one danger that we're seeing is for, you know, adolescents and teenagers who all of them, right, are like complete lunatics. And they're associating that with like a diagnosis, and maybe they're getting help and maybe they're not, but it's sort of pulling them down a path that maybe they wouldn't have necessarily been pulled down. In terms of them sort of self-diagnosing or getting these diagnoses really early. And I do want to say I'm a huge proponent of therapy for children. So to make that very clear, both my kids have done therapy. But I was like, oh, like it kind of like pulled me back for a second, like, oh, and then I've been thinking about that conversation. I can't stop thinking about it and how, you know, we do self-define a lot in 2022 by our diagnosis and how limiting that can be. Like, oh, well, I don't do that because I'm an anxious person, or I can't manage that because, you know, I have a prevalence towards depression. And that makes me really sad, honestly, just because I know I'm going to sound like a greeting card, but like life is super short. And, you know, to think that there are things that aren't possible for you to do because you've been given this diagnosis or you've given yourself this diagnosis is bleak to me. So, you know, my brother and sister-in-law are pregnant, which is so exciting, like so exciting. And I've spent the past few days going through baby clothes and even went through his photographs in detail from childhood, which was such a beautiful way to get to know my brother again because there's such a big age difference, you know? And I like matched photos with items. So if I found, you know, something my mother would say, a onesie when he was a baby, and I found a photo of him in it, like all that is sort of put together. It was really hard emotional work. And there was part of me that wanted to stop and say, you know, it's easy for you to fall into depression right now, especially around grief issues. Like, you should just stop. And it's like, but no, but this is like this beautiful, hard thing that I have to walk through. And so I think when therapy can kind of limit those beautiful, hard things that we need to walk through, which I think it actually can, I think that gets dangerous.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about this with the next article, actually, about sort of that therapy can become an excuse to not do hard things, and it's self-care almost as a excuse or as a identifier.
Isn't the whole point of therapy so that you can do things that you're scared of doing? Like I've known people who struggle with anxiety, for example, you know, and they don't like taking being on the airplane, or they don't like getting in elevators or whatever. But at least with cognitive behavioral therapy, the whole point of that is to learn strategies for helping you to do things and to sort of manage your emotions in those difficult times. It's not to limit you; it's to open life up. But I guess we're talking about the next article. What I thought of with this article was actually, I thought about Crocodile Dundee. Remember Crocodile Dundee?
Yes.
And there's a scene.
That's not a knife.
Deep cut.
This is a knife. There's a scene where the main female character, whose name I can't remember, she's going to therapy. And Crocodile Dundee is like, why are you going to see a head shrinker? Like, are you, or someone they know is going to therapy. And he says, is that person crazy? And she says, no, just, they need someone to talk to about their problems. And then she says, Crocodile, how do you deal with problems in the town that you come from? And he says, well, you go down to the pub and you tell Wally, and then Wally tells everybody else, and then problem solved. You just get it out in the open as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder whether therapy becomes a substitute for friendship. For
100%.
Absolutely. And honestly, I even think about this podcast, right? Like, what do we do here? For an hour or an hour and 15 minutes, we sit and talk about our lives and we listen to each other. And I'm going to say I have a few people, I'd probably do that with you more consistently than just about anybody else. Like maybe my wife, maybe Jamie,
right.
But friendship is in such short supply. We've talked about that a lot. People are so alienated, and there's such fear to be honest with anyone about what's actually going on in your life, lest you be rejected or kind of wear them out. But here you have this person that you're paying to listen to you. And God willing, they're trained and they can help you find some healing and some peace and some resolution. But I also think, again, just being listened to is so unbelievably powerful, and to not judge, to listen to somebody and to not judge them, which is kind of what friendship is sort of about, isn't it? Which we seem not to have time for.
You don't have to pay
for.
the friend. That's there's no contingency in terms of you don't pay the friend. And I think therapy, although it can look on the surface like it's something self-centered, I'm just going to go work on myself, etc. It's really a way of feeling less alone, so that you can and being drawn out of yourself by hearing those words. I think that's deeply powerful. And I was at a conference this past weekend at 1517, and Stephen Paulson, the great Lutheran theologian, he talked about the conscience being sort of heavy laden, and we're always looking to unload our confession on other people because we just want to unload it on the world. I want to unload it on my spouse. I want to unload it on my friends. But I've got I want to say that everything is as strong as out there, or whatever it is. I'm prowling around trying to offload this burden of bad feeling, guilt, shame, etc. And if you've lost that, if we don't have friendships and if we don't have church, then therapy is I think it's a better solution than a lot of other solutions.
Sure.
Yes,
I would say that I I do wonder a little bit if it become like you don't need just therapy. You need, and I don't think therapists, a lot of people would say that I've been in therapy 30 years and I'm still the same screwed up person. Like I haven't actually made that much progress, but I have felt it's made life bearable to be listened to once a week by someone who is on my side. And that's enough. And if churches aren't providing that, and if other friends aren't providing that, then I want to see people get some relief from the burdens they're feeling. I suppose there can be a kind of I would love to see the burden of shame and guilt or the confession be met not only with a listening, but also with a absolution. Like, I think that's a more powerful, potent thing, but I also recognize that that's bungled so often. And
non-judgmental listening almost is absolution.
I agree. I agree. It functionally is basically the same.
Yeah. Like I hear you, I see you, and I love you.
But Sarah, I also do see there. Freddie DeBoer wrote
Sarah's
something
not sure
recently.
about that.
I don't think it's the same thing at all.
As absolution.
Well, it's experienced.
No.
It's experienced emotionally as absolution. Just being able to offload.
Yeah, I can see that. I know when I've brought sins to therapy, when I've talked about how much I've like yelled at my kids or, been hateful towards my husband, I don't get the same relief at all in a therapist's office by saying it out loud that I get on my knees in the confession. So I guess
or
for
saying
me,
you're sorry to those people that you harmed.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge,
You're right.
gosh. So, but even that, like, because I can say I'm sorry, but even then, there's something about confessing sin to one another that the sin still lingers for me. Mm-hmm. And when and maybe that's just my own neurotic brain, but like in full confession to God, like that's when I feel the merciful work of Jesus. And that feels very different for me, but.
Well, Sarah, I do want to pick up on one thing you said that I think that the search for identity is so palpable. We see it so much today as like a solution to our problems. If I could just sort of have a fixed point that I could hang who I am on, and I think for a lot of people, and younger people, I think are prone to this right now, is like your diagnosis becomes your identity, and it's what doctors talk about. You become married to your illness, and that is there's the self-diagnosis. There's this sort of who am I? You start to ask yourself, well, who are you without the depression, or who are you without the anxiety? And then you also notice that the some of the self-diagnoses, we rarely diagnose ourselves as like, schizophrenic. It's a like serious people who had to deal with serious mental illness that's debilitating and destructive. And like Freddie DeBoer talks about it in terms of he's got a sort of the type of mania that involves him wanting to, kill people. And that's not like somehow to be accepted and to be empathized with. There's some sense in which he needs to be restrained and helped, and that there's more than just. Okay, so this gets into the next article, in fact, which is Hugh Green wrote a couple weeks before that in the New York Times, saying he's a therapist who said we have reached peak mental health. We're talking more and more about our mental health, and this has been enormously positive. But the term mental health is a euphemism, and euphemisms are what we use when we want to obscure something. This language, in contrast to mental illness, encourages us to focus on the regulation of more or less transient states and on the maintenance of something we supposedly all have. Mental health conjures phenomena that are more or less relatable, anxiety and depression. But who is being excluded as a result? The change in language is supposed to address stigma, but it has simply moved our attention away from the very people who face the most stigma, those with diagnoses of schizophrenia, for example, or symptoms that do not allow for ready participation in the mental health curriculum. And then he goes on to say, consider the relatively recent notion of a mental health day. We absolutely need to take days off work for our mental health sometimes, and it is important that employers recognize our needs. But people also deserve days away from their work without justification. He goes on to say, when mental health is given as a principal motivator for our choices, we are prioritizing our own experiences. As a result, there's less room for moral or ethical considerations for our behavior, and also less room for motivations that have to do with social, community, or familial commitments, or doing something for its own sake. There are probably lots of things we should do in spite of our mental health. Helping others, forming deep emotional ties that may then need to be painfully broken, becoming immersed in sometimes maddening, at times obsessive political or creative projects. These are choices that need deep, rational, ethical, and personal engagement. Just another sort of interesting wrinkle to the mental health discussion. I just think that talking about mental health as opposed to mental illness is a way of the tyranny of positivity, I think, coming through a little bit. And like, you can't say there's anything wrong with me. And like, this is I think low anthropology releases us from this burden, but it is very much like, I don't like talking about mental illness. I want to talk about mental health.
Or even wellness.
Right.
Wellness is a step
right.
further,
And then we're
again,
like
but I
right into
think
bath bombs. You know what I mean? Like hop, skip, and a jump.
It's generally great that I think it's generally a really positive thing about that we're talking more about mental health, illness, etc. Whatever the thing is, it's not categorically ignored as something that is hysterical. But I don't know, Sarah, you look like you've got some serious thoughts. I want to hear.
I have a lot of thoughts. So, first of all, I want to say that like easily a third of like the mental health professionals that are on Instagram are ridiculous. And people go on and like get the advice and then they try to use it on their husbands and their kids and and they have never actually sat in a therapeutic session. And I find that to be incredibly disturbing. I love this juxtaposition because all I can see is just these like self-righteous, mostly white women, although there's some women of color who are like really pushing the mental health thing online, which is great. But also some of it, I'm like, that is bad advice. Just like basking in sunlight, and then over in the dark corner is this huddled mass of broken, wounded bodies of people who actually struggle with profound mental illness every day. And they're still not okay. And we still won't talk about them. And you know what I mean? Like, it's still not glamorous, right? Like, to have bipolar depression. Like, it's just, so that is very striking to me. I'm of two minds about this. Like, yes, we're all talking about mental illness. We're all talking about wellness. Okay, great. But what I wonder about is I read this week that in 2019, there were, I'm going to get the number right, but I swear it was like there were 8 billion snow crab. Okay. They recently did a count and it's at 1 billion. And really, it's because of global warming. And I wonder if there's not so many terrifying things out there in the world that this is the one thing internally that we can sort of, oh God, people are going to send so many angry emails, selfishly focus on and feel like we're perfecting and feel like we're making better as a way to avoid the fact that Russia might just like blow the world up. Do you know what I mean?
It's like the secular Benedict option, kind of. It's like secular monasticism.
Only it's like just yourself. You know what I mean? Like there's no community.
It's only you.
Yeah, it's really like disturbing.
It can feel like a culturally approved way of just being more self-involved.
Yeah.
Like that there's and
it
like
can.
Like I don't care what's going out there. I just know that I'm doing my best to be the best person I can be. So you all
because what we know is like being in community with each other. I mean, literally, this is not like Sarah Christian, right? This is like actual research tells us being in community with each other, right? And helping each other, like being of service, like AA, being of service in other people's lives is actually one of the most healing things we can do.
That's you're not lying. I think there's.
You know what I mean?
So that's not what people are doing on Twitter. They're not being of service to each other on Twitter.
They're not being of service to one another on the Twitters.
I agree 100%, and I think that this is why therapy alone is not the. We when we overdo it, we don't realize that when when I'm finished talking with a therapist, and I talked to my therapist yesterday, I felt more equipped and more excited
Totally.
to go and serve my family and my children who needed me, and to talk to the Mockingbird staff who was in town. And like, I definitely felt unburdened and fresh. So I want to like acknowledge that
Absolutely.
deeply. And I don't know what I'd do
I'm
without it.
actively in therapy. Absolutely. Yes.
But it's hard. It is hard not to see it as a cultural symptom sometimes.
Yeah.
And RJ, what do you think here as a
RJ's
man
not in
who's
therapy, so we're judging him.
in profound need of a lot of therapy right now?
I'm not currently. I am in. I'm in a little bit of therapy, not as much as I should be. I think I should be. Can I say something honestly? It's really expensive.
It's so expensive.
It's really expensive.
Yeah.
And it's like, I would love to see a therapist every week. Do I have $1,000 a month to spend on therapy? Like, I don't know if I do right now. And I hate to say
all the best ones don't take insurance.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yes.
It's like a mark of pride within this.
I hate to say that. Like, I got kids to put through college, and I've got debts to pay off, and I know I should be. It's really expensive.
It's really expensive.
So contribute today to the RJ Heyman in Therapy
Oh,
Fund.
perfect. That's exactly what we need. Sarah, I don't know. I was trying to think about what you were. There was something you were talking about that sounded very. I don't know. I hate to put things in such starkly theological terms, but kind of theology of glory versus theology of the cross. Like, does therapy again just become a way to glorify ourselves, to live our best life, to draw attention to ourselves, to not tell the truth actually, to pretend to be something that we're not? Or is it a way that we begin to grapple with the realities of life and sort of call the thing what it is? Does it lead us into honesty and humanity and compassion and empathy, or does it lead us into self-righteousness and hiding and ultimate despair? Because that leads to ultimate despair.
Totally.
So I don't know. And I thought what Stephen Paulson said about us all having a need to unburden ourselves is so true. And we don't have spaces to do that in. So what happens oftentimes is someone does unburden themselves, but they do it in the wrong context. They do it in the wrong way.
Yes.
And I also say, I think this is it's a huge thing for professional Christian types, for ministers, because you need to have a place to unburden yourself, but the pulpit is not the place to do that. Your congregation is not the place to do that, you know? And so how do you find a way and a place to be a human being and sort of let it all hang out in the way that everyone needs to, and to tell the truth, without doing it inappropriately. So it's a struggle.
It is
It's a struggle.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
it's part of the conversation. I'm glad. I think we've. I thank you for addressing it with me.
You're welcome, Terry Gross.
The next article appeared in The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago from Derek Thompson. He did a poll asking people, what does no one understand about your job? What does no one understand about your job? And I'll just read a couple of entries and conclude with the pastor. The first one is a software engineer who said, there are two things the world should know about the work we do. It's amazing that any of this stuff works at all. The simple act of performing a search for best burger in Minneapolis from your phone requires not only hundreds of software systems to execute code in less than 1 second, but also communication via radio waves, copper cables, and fiber optic lines. It's mind-boggling that it even works, let alone that it works almost all the time. But two, everything is broken all the time. The internet is incredibly resilient. The network and the software systems that run on it are designed to expect failures and minimize disruption from them, which is a good thing because failures happen constantly. Could be a bug in the new code, a ship drops an anchor on a fiber optic line, or, this may be my favorite, some of the systems grow to be so big that they take on emergent properties that no one intended or predicted, resulting in unexpected failures. There you go. Hashtag low anthropology for you people. Secondly is a financial analyst who says, I am an analyst by profession. I read a lot. I write a fair amount. I build a lot of presentations and speak to a lot of CEOs, boards of directors, and the like. Here's what people don't get about my job. The job is about numbers, but everyone thinks in stories. Perhaps data drives that story, or data is the story, or maybe compounding anecdotes drive the story. Whatever it is, it's a story. We are narrative creatures, and we want to be told stories, whether it is about scientific progress or human frailty or what the world will look like in a year, a decade, a century from now. And not only that, most of the people that consider themselves the most rational objective are the most prone to storytelling path dependence, particularly as they become very successful. The narratives become the law, and but also I would think when he talks about story, to me, it's this sort of I wrote to reference a book that people are emotional creatures, and that the stories are the technology of the heart, and information not so much. But thirdly, this is for you guys, pastor. I've served as a pastor of a few churches over the past 20 years. In addition to the weekly preaching, Bible study, and pastoral care calls, I also have the blessing of officiating at funerals and weddings. The experience of preparing for and officiating a funeral is infinitely more interesting and more important than the same work for weddings. The whole of the community is much more honest and real around funerals than weddings. It is on the occasion of death that we get down to the truly important things in our common life together. What do you think about all of that?
I mean, I'm obsessed. I think weddings are literally the fakest day of our lives. So I totally agree. I mean, I think a lot of what, I'm sorry if I just upset everyone who's gotten married recently, but you'll know. Give it a few years.
You'll know.
I mean, for me, a lot of it is just how important story is in a lot of those different realms, which I'm kind of fascinated by. And hidden, like, I love that there's like all these hidden, it's sort of like hidden stories in the way the internet works and the way technology works, even from the first guy, you know, that we don't even know are happening. Like, what a beautiful, interesting thought. Like, I'm just thinking about my 11-year-old yesterday who's like, why is the internet so slow? You know, and like how, like, there's all these machinations happening that we're totally unaware of.
Wow.
That everything's kind of a miracle.
Yeah.
Tom. I sent you guys that article. It's short about, Tom Hanks apparently has written a book or something recently where he said he feels like he's made about 4 kind of okay movies, and he said, I still don't understand how a movie ever comes together. There's so many disappointments. There's so many people. There's so many complications. He's like, the fact that any movie ever gets made is a total miracle and mystery. And it reminds me of the Geoffrey Rush character in Shakespeare in Love, who's always being hounded by the financiers. And it's like, how's this going to happen? How's this going to happen? And he goes, I don't know. It's a mystery. So somehow it all works out in the end. Yeah. Somehow it all works, even though it seems like a total dumpster fire. Somehow it all works out in the end, and that's kind of life and ministry and technology and honestly, finance and everything.
As I've been traveling around trying to talk to people about this whole point of view of low anthropology, everyone, it can sound like a negative thing, a negative verdict, or sort of a darker view of life, but it's not. I mean, it's more like, given how broken everything is, look at how much things work. Given how crazy people act towards one another. Look at how many acts of beauty and kindness and goodness that you've been the recipient of. Yeah. Like that's a God's work. That's also just God working through people, and that's an amazing state of awe and wonder at the world. And that to me is reason to rejoice. And I will say, I don't do funerals, but we did the season of the Brothers Zoll, and John just keeps, my older brother who's a minister in New York, half of his stories are about funerals. And it's always about and I talked to this person and they said this about their mother, or I talked to this sibling who hadn't been in church for years, and we really got down to it. And he has all of these unbelievably encouraging and exciting and beautiful stories from funerals.
Yes. Yeah.
And the wedding stories are usually about stress and presentation. And, I think there's, as we talk about, is aspirational beauty, and that there's something unique about that day, shall we say. But the wedding stories are usually about crises averted, or insane happenstance. But the funeral stories are almost all about healing and forgiveness, or it's extreme anger or resentment, but they're about the most real things in the world.
Yeah, I think the difference between weddings and funerals, I've never had to think about this, but I think the difference between weddings and funerals is that weddings, we try to foist meaning. Mm-hmm. And in a funeral, you have no choice. Like, meaning is foisted upon you by God. Like, it's it's so different, you know? And that's why, like, most weddings, especially because I'm not great at, like, emotional romance. Like, most weddings I'm at, like, my face the whole time is just like, oh.
You should see her face right now.
Yeah, it's not good.
Do not invite Sarah Condon to your wedding.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, like, funerals, I feel like I can relax, you know, because I know I'm going to walk in and something miraculous is going to happen.
That's incredible. It's counterintuitive though.
Yeah.
We like, you know, a lot of people are like, I'm not even going to bring my child to the funeral because it's too intense.
It's just so dumb. Bring your kid to the funeral, for God's sake. Yeah.
RJ, you're the
literally,
person
for
here
Christ's sake. Okay, RJ.
who does funerals all the time.
So many funerals.
Yeah.
There is something incredibly powerful about it. I don't quite know. I don't know what to say. I'm thinking about the funerals I've done recently for these wonderful,
well,
blessed
what do you
saints.
say? I mean, you're the one preaching at these things. What do you?
I usually say
acknowledge the
something
sadness?
like, "Yeah, I totally acknowledge it."
But you preach the
I usually
resurrection?
preach a very similar homily sermon. I keep it short,
Sure.
you know, and I talk about how funerals are a day when we remember, when we mourn, when we listen specifically to the promises that God has made, and then finally we celebrate. You know, because we know that this life was not the end, and we're going to see this person again. That they've received a new body and a new mind, and they're in a place where there's no more pain or death. Or so I try to remind people that it is okay to mourn. It's okay to cry. You know, we still call things, you know, celebration of life. You know, celebration of life service. But it's really a celebration of God's grace. And when someone you knew and someone who really had faith, there is tremendous freedom just to tell the truth. There was a guy who died recently who he wasn't doing well. He had a surgery for a back issue, and it cleared up the back issue, but then it exacerbated his breathing, and he just couldn't get the oxygen that he needed into his lungs. But he called me and he said, "You know, RJ, like I'm done. I've lived a good life. Like I'm ready to go." And so I rushed to the hospital. We spent some time together, and a day later he passed away. And he was totally at peace, and he was surrounded by his family, and they knew that he loved them, and that that they expressed their love for him, and it was really beautiful. And his daughter just said, you know, he lived like he died. Sort of when he made up his mind to do something, he did it. You know, and when he was ready to go, it was time to go.
But I mean,
So-
I've seen believers not have that. I mean, I've seen them be absolutely terrified of death, and like if I'm judging their faith based on how they acted at
I
the
haven't
last
seen
moments,
that as much.
I haven't
much it is,
either.
Mark?
I haven't seen
Okay.
that as much.
Those were
no.
bad Christians, Dave.
No, I'm not saying. I'm sure that's a
They're
real
not-
thing.
Yeah.
I definitely had people who thought they were close to death be like, "How is this real? How can I know?" And to be able to speak some words of comfort and hope into their life. But I have not seen too many people be totally terrified of death. Maybe they're just not telling me the truth. Maybe they're more honest with John than they are
They're
with
like
me.
performance
I don't-
Christians until
Totally.
I love
yeah.
hearing this. I hope it's true. I also just know that I hope that also God, accepts those of us who
absolutely.
are of two minds about death. You know?
100%. And I have no idea how I'm going to feel when I
Yeah,
get there. We
for
will.
sure.
We will see.
For sure.
We will see.
Well, let's talk about this second to last article. This is by Russell Moore, the sort of famous writer, Baptist guy, or now I think he got booted from there, so he's now working for Christianity Today. He wrote a kind of a hot take or a counterintuitive article called "Bring Back Altar Calls." Bring back altar calls. He says this: the altar call is out of step with almost every sector of American Christianity right now, and it's easy to see why. After all, an altar call can, at its worst, represent our key vulnerabilities as religious people, such as the confusion of an emotional experience with the gospel. These practices can appeal to our weakness for the quest of bigness, with pastors judged each week by how many people went forward. And an altar call can represent our tendency to be drawn toward novelty and away from the history and liturgy of the church. In Christianity Today, a generation ago, historian Martin Marty argued that evangelical churches of that day were growing at least in part because they met the human longing for the right kind of crisis, an ever-present opportunity for people to hear a call to start over and to leave behind the old self for the new one. The altar call at its best balanced the individual and the community. This was true not just for seekers, but for all of us. Every week, with rhythm and regularity, we were reminded of who we were, sinners that Jesus loved. No matter how short I had fallen, the Lord received me, just as I am, without one plea, but that thou blood was shed for me. And every week, at least for those few moments, we were reminded of those around us who had not yet embraced the good news that Jesus loves them too, and we shouldn't give up on anyone who might walk the aisle one day. We often criticize ourselves for our individualism, rightly in some ways, but the altar call at its best balanced the individual and the community. The invitation was that Jesus died not just for humanity abstractly, but for you. At the same time, no one walking down that aisle was alone. A silently cheering cloud of witnesses was all around. Those of you in more liturgical traditions will note that all of this you already have. The weekly confession of sin followed by absolution, the weekly coming forward to receive the Eucharist. You'll get no argument from me, except to say that maybe you can bear with the baby steps of the rest of us, that you might see that low churchers need liturgy too. Invitation hymns, like tent crusades and spring revivals, probably aren't coming back. But as we look at an American Christianity adrift, perhaps we should ask how we can remind ourselves every week that Christ died for the ungodly.
That's so good.
Isn't that great?
Dave,
I thought to myself, yeah.
It reminds me of you said years ago, you said this to me, that I feel like it was someone at Christ Church who, like, after you preached, was like, I mean, every sermon you all preach, it wasn't just you. Every sermon you all preach around here is like, you just assume everyone's in an existential crisis. Do you remember this? And you're like, isn't everyone in an existential crisis? So I love that he gives us this much credit that, like, our confession and absolution and the Eucharist are some sort of an altar call. That's so cute, you know. But I don't think most Episcopalians would identify it as such. I mean, I love that as a preaching mechanism, as like a thing to point out. For me, as someone who leads worship, I actually do think of, like, I love altar call meets existential crisis in preaching. And I do think that is very important when we preach, to preach in that way. I mean, you know, it's always striking to me that so many preachers, and I've you know, I was certainly trained this way in seminary, that we're supposed to somehow bring some new thing, you know, like, it's like, did you know that the Babylonians, you know, something like that, right? And actually, you just tell the same story every week, and that is the most compelling thing to anyone in the pews, because the same story is Christ died for the ungodly, and all of the woundedness and the pain and the regret that you carry, like that's what we mean by that phrase, you know? And that's like all anyone ever needs to hear.
Yeah.
I've been at churches where communion felt like an altar call. Maybe not every week, but pretty regularly.
That's so nice.
Yeah, because, I mean, you know, there was some emotional manipulation involved,
Sure.
but, like, who cares?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
the music
Who
was
cares?
insanely good.
Yeah.
And you're coming down, and the way the service was structured. I mean, it does make me think, like, I love the way our service is structured, but also, like, the sermon and the communion are separated by a lot of stuff, right? You have the sermon, and people might be sort of feeling something, and then you do the Nicene Creed, and then you have the prayer, the confession, the announcements, the offertory. By the time you get to communion, you're like, what was said in the sermon? I don't remember. So maybe there's something to structure. But I mean, I sort of came to faith as a result of something like an altar call. You know, like, bow your head and pray this prayer with me. And I think there was a time in my life when I thought I'd sort of made a good choice, you know, and that was not helpful. But I'm also, I think in the moment when it actually happened, it just felt like a total emotional release, and I felt sort of loved and forgiven and accepted and known in a way I never had before. So I'm
Yeah.
all about the power of the altar call. It's just a matter of figuring out, how and when do you do it, and I don't know, how much do you need to manage something like that, or how do you just throw it out and see what happens? I have been struck recently. I've heard stories about people who aren't churchgoers and weren't raised Christian, but then they want to go to church, and what they actually want to go to is something more like a tent revival than a church service. They want the real thing.
Yeah.
They want the emotion. They want the
That's
fever.
why they
the
would go
fever
to
pitch.
Pentecostal churches most of the time. I
That's
think.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. They
Come
want
to
something.
come to Embert Tyler. People
Come
cry
to
there.
That's
Everett.
right.
People, well, I think it's so funny that this charge of emotional manipulation, I have less and less time for. I accept that it's a real thing, but I also feel like everyone is trying to manipulate you emotionally at all times.
All the time.
So, like, why not be emotionally manipulated by the truth or by God or by love? That's what the message is here, that is like that you're loved and accepted and forgiven. Like, that's, if I'm going to be emotionally manipulated, sign me
right.
up for that, And also, it just is like, we are all emotional creatures. It's not like there's some other universe where we're all making these rational, like, informed decisions.
Totally.
That's why we go to
Things.
movies. That's why we listen to
I was
music.
just
Is because we
thinking
want to
that,
experience something
yes.
emotional. Or we want
I was
to.
literally thinking of the movie It's a Wonderful Life this morning and tearing up while I was drinking my coffee. Like, we're not going to write Jimmy Stewart off as emotional manipulation. Do you know what I mean? It's catharsis. It's
catharsis.
Abreaction,
Yes.
right?
Abreaction.
Yeah.
I saw some like a headline from the Hard Times, which is a satirical newspaper. They're like, man presses repeat on eviscerating song because it didn't cause quite enough pain the first time he listened to it. How many times have we? I need to feel even sadder than that just made me feel. I got to hear it again.
Did we listen to rock and roll because we were depressed, or were we depressed because we listened to rock and roll? Was that High Fidelity? Anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing I that I have to say is, like, the token Southerner with impoverished roots is that, my parents both had stories because they both grew up in tiny Southern Baptist churches in the Delta, and of, like, the same, I think it's like in all of these tiny churches, like, the same mom would always, I wish I could remember this family's name, but she'd be like, oh, every Sunday, the whole family would get up during the altar call and they'd be crying and they'd come up and somebody'd start singing Just As I Am. And it was like, oh, when are they going to get it together? And that was, but what I love is no one ever said to the Jones family or whoever, that's not appropriate. You've been up enough. You can't come up anymore.
Exactly.
There's something so beautiful about that.
Time to stand on your own 2 feet.
Right. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's like this cliche. It's like, well, I guess I'm getting born again,
Yeah.
And but at the
Every
same
morning,
time,
man.
if what we're talking about, if what Russell's saying is true, it's like we need it every day.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful thing that there was a place for that kind of, well, we talk about crying in church. It's the best place to cry in public, that we
Yeah.
got.
Yeah.
So, it's not just a therapist's office. It's good to cry with other people around too.
totally.
Well, let's finish with this article from our friend and Mockingbird contributor Ken Sundit Jones. Now, Ken Jones, who I just got to see in, there's a couple different Ken Jones out there. We were friends with another one too in Miami. But Ken Sundit Jones is a professor at Grandview College or maybe University in Iowa, and he's just been named the first ever Gerhard Ferde Chair of, I think, systematic theology.
Okay, Ken.
Yeah, I think Ken is so funny about it. He's like, I thought my career was over. Then all of a sudden they come to me with this honorific. I've just been trying to fly under the radar. So he's this really amazing guy, and he's been writing for us a lot. And he was a student of Gerhard Ferde. Now, Gerhard Ferde, we haven't talked about him maybe as much recently as we have before, but he was a Lutheran theologian, or a true radical. And when we talk about the theology of the cross versus theology of glory, we're usually referencing his work in some way. And he wrote a book called On Being a Theologian of the Cross, which is really foundational for the Mockingbird Project, but it will mess you up. Anyway, he talks about it's the 50th anniversary of one of Ferde's books called Where God Met Man. And they were published in 1972. And so he wrote something called Where God Met Me. This is a post for Mockingbird, and he talked about being taught by Professor Ferde in the 70s. He said, I'd like to say what Gerhard did in that worship classroom, this is in seminary, was open a door for me into the delights of studying theology. But that's far too mild a description. What he really did there was rummage around in my brain and reorder everything I knew about the world, the church, the gospel, and the Lord. Over time, the edifice of my faith came to look less like earthly success, pain management, congregation strategies, or pastoring as leadership or helping, and more like a couple rough-hewn beams pegged together on a rock outcropping and a tomb carved into another rock. He gave me what the subtitle of Where God Meets Man declares, a down-to-earth approach to the gospel. What Gerhard meant by that phrase was a corrective to the theology of glory that hinged on the assumption that almighty free will produced better religion, and which in 1972 he regarded as having run rampant in the church. I'd argue that nothing has changed. He used the story of Jacob's dream at Bethel in describing a theology built on climbing Jacob's ladder. The church's proclamation and witness had been weakened by offering sinners works which they could do to ascend to godly heights of personal piety and religious fervor, something which always placed Christ in a penultimate position at best. Where God Meets Man, the book, has always been uninteresting to religious people with grand plans for changing the world, and anathema if you're a climber or striver or macher, to use a fine Yiddish term. But I was ripe for the picking. I didn't know how low my anthropological potential was, but as a former bedwetter, as a former bedwetter, now grown kid who, try though he might, couldn't fix his family, I had experienced the reality of the grave. I knew what it meant to die helpless under sin. When Gerhard said, well, I suppose we ought to get started, he became the bailing hook God used to reach into my deadness. The message of our Lord and his cross on Ferde's lips and on the pages of the green and blue book wasn't foolishness to me. It was the power of God given to me and for me.
It's so good.
Thank you, Ken.
I don't really know what to say about that. I mean, except that this vision of like all of the things that we had been aspiring to falling away, and there's just the cross and the rock is deeply relatable to me in this sort of new era of my life. I don't recognize myself some days, you know, in a good way, in a really good way. But yeah, it's, I mean, I've never heard it put so clearly.
I will say I'm living in tension with this all, because I believe that 100% personally I do. That's the foundation of like all my preaching, my teaching, my life, everything. And yet I'm rectoring, pastoring, leading this church that I want to see grow. And I'm trying to reconcile that a little bit. Like what is, because Dave, you remember when I planted that church in New York, I think I tried to plant it in the most gospel-centric way I possibly could with regard to my leadership, my preaching, everything, and just kind of to sort of wait on God a little bit, wait for God to provide and show up. And he did in powerful ways. And at the same time, that church didn't make it. And not as a result of the theology. I think there were extenuating factors or whatever.
Right.
But me and your brother John and other rectors who are at various churches around the country, we talk about this all the time. Like, what does gospel ministry look like? What does it mean to proclaim this message of God's unconditional salvation and power and our raising the dead to life and all that sort of stuff, and yet still like raise a budget and manage property and manage people, and raise up leaders and all that sort of stuff. It's mysterious.
There's definitely a tension with the institution of the church. There's no question about it.
There is, and I've wrestled with that too, because when you look in the pages of the New Testament, there's nothing really like the institutional church today, right? There's a bunch of small little house churches. There's no professional clergy. People are just trying to not get killed. There's no buildings to maintain. There's no people to be paid, and yet.
But there are like rich ladies,
There are rich ladies. That's right. But it does also seem that for the last, 1,500 years or so, the institutional church seems to be the way that God has chosen to work.
One way.
One way, a pretty big way that God has chosen to work.
Way. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wrestle with this, and it would be easier just to preach and teach it and not have to manage a budget and a staff, but that's the reality of what church leadership looks like today, and I'm not quite sure how to reconcile all that.
Well, Ken's at a different stage of life here, and he's sort of looking back, and I think he's probably seeing pretty clearly about what matters, and that all of the. I mean, I know that my father would say certainly, he doesn't think very much about. He spent a lot of years raising budgets and new buildings and all that stuff, but that most of that just sort of slides off the brain, and you remember the people, and you remember the funerals. Remember the funerals, and you remember this message of hope that you have been entrusted with. And I think, I don't know. But I'll say this though, RJ, for what it's worth. Like when I got to worship at Trinity and Holy Trinity in Palm Beach, I felt there was something of this that not only this altar call feel,
God, I hope so,
but the sort of God coming to meet us in our actual reality and sin, and with pardon and forgiveness, and the fact that you sort of have to, the sacrifice that it entails is that you have to sort of hedge your bets, or sort of live in tension with this. That maybe that's the burden of being in ministry.
Keeps you on your knees, keeps you humble.
Yeah.
But I know what he's talking. What Ferde is highlighting is the heart of the matter.
100%.
And the
100%.
institutional stuff, it looks different. It's always changing. It's like kind of. So many of these churches. I met with this wonderful group of mainline pastors recently, not in our denomination, in a different mainline denomination. They said, They are so energized by the gospel of God's grace for sinners, but they said, my denomination, so much of the anxiety is around property management and keeping, these summer camps alive, or keeping the institution going. And yes, those are lovely properties and probably beautiful things, but it's kind of a smokescreen, or it's almost a millstone around people's neck to keep an institution going for the sake of keeping the institution going. So that doesn't help pay the bills, or pay University of Texas for the tuition or anything like that. But it is certainly a reminder of what we need to hear when we're in the grave.
100%. And that's all I want is for people to hear that, is for people to hear that and experience that. Yeah.
And possibly being buried in a church graveyard, like that. What Sarah, you got any?
Well, I do. I have a couple of thoughts. I think one thing I will say is when Mom and Dad died, it was almost like the way I had Neil. Like I had Neil over Christmas break, and then I went back to school. Mom and Dad died over Christmas break, and then in January I went back to my job with students, and I was such a train wreck. I burst into tears in front of them all the time. And I did no extra stuff. I can't imagine how bad my sermons were. And the ministry has grown. And I have no explanation for that.
Yeah.
So that was a very powerful experience for me in ministry. Now, again, I'm not raising a budget. I'm not doing a lot of I don't have staff. It's just me, which is hard, but also is really great because I'm not managing someone. But just the way that the students filled in the gap, stepped up, and then suddenly there were more of them, I was just like, what is God doing? And what that makes me think of is sometimes we also have to recognize when God wants a thing to die. And I do think a lot of the institutional church lives in this place of but we have to keep this going, but this can't die, when it's so clear that God's vision for this, and that's a hard thing for us to wrap our brains around, but God's vision for this is that this institution would die.
So that runs so counter to the theology of glory, or just simply the world saying, no, the success is caught up in something being sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than saying it's not a final judgment on the fact that this didn't do wonderful things.
There are seasons, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you know, it's like it's almost like the way we think about our own human bodies now, where, you know, we're all going to live forever and we're all going to be beautiful and young forever. And it's like, why do we, you know, why do we force this on our institutions as well? Like, at some point, everything dies. So I think there is some relief in recognizing how little control we have. But as somebody who is married to a rector, I fully understand. But also, RJ, I just want to say it's so brave for you to talk about like living in that tension, because I think that's very real. And it's very hard. Those two things are I think it would be so much easier for you. Like, here's my suggestion is if you actually just ignore the theology stuff and put all your energy into church growth.
Totally. That's my plan.
And forsake the gospel and tell people they're actually getting better. And, you know, like that's my suggestion for you to sleep better at night. You're welcome.
That's been a very effective model for many parishes around the country. So that's what I'm going to do.
I was on the ground floor with RJ there in New York, and I remember thinking to myself, this is impossible. You need to have a terrible theology in order to start a successful church. I mean, and then you need to have a great theology for it to continue in some way.
Yeah,
it's like you need the energy and optimism and high anthropology of young people to get it going, and then you need the sort of wisdom and low anthropology of an older person for it to continue.
You need a slightly depressed 60-year-old to then run it.
Well,
it's just it's impossible. It's impossible by the grace of God. By the grace of God. Yeah.
And as someone who was on the receiving end of a whole lot of fruit from that quote unquote failed project, it's like it's kind of cool to see over the years how that's worked. But
Absolutely.
I remember RJ. I remember the day that you were so bereft about it. You're like, I think we're gonna have to get people to sign commitment cards that they would come 3 Sundays a month. And I said,
did I say that? I didn't say that.
Oh, that was on the block. And then you sort of
the crazy things, and we're trying to keep stuff alive.
But then he woke up. I remember, much to his credit, my friend Rutger Jan said, if I've gotten to this stage, then it's time to cut.
It's over.
It's cut ties. Or this is so much. This is too directly dissonant with what we're actually about.
Totally.
You don't remember that, RJ?
I don't, man. No, I don't. I'm going to cry too.
That's so beautiful.
He's blocked it out. Sorry, should I not have said it on
No, it's
on the air?
okay. It's okay. I just want to say, like...
That's the degree of your desperation, by the way, at the time, was like you were willing to kind of go back on everything you believed.
Well, it's a crazy thing. I love what I do, and there's nothing I would rather do. And there's nothing I can do, I think. But man, it's hard. Even when it's good, it's hard.
Yeah.
Even when it's good, it's hard.
Totally.
You know? So... Yeah. So maybe that's, I don't know. Yeah. Hope that's a word of grace.
We got the
to
Pharisee
some
and the tax
clergy out
collector this weekend at church, and I think that there's a whole lot of where God meets man in that particular scenario, and that those of us who bungle the church growth leadership gospel balancing act, that does not disqualify us in any way from the grace of the one who goes home justified. Is not the one with the high marks. So I think that's enough for now. Now that we've made both of you guys cry.
I have to say before we
in
get off,
in the category of inappropriate disclosure, Exhibit A.
No, I love it. I have to say that to everyone listening, that TJ, who is our unsung hero, who makes this podcast sound good, Dave and RJ all moved their calendar so that we could meet early this morning so I can go see my brother and my sister-in-law and sort of be the 39-year-old grandmother that I am now because they're expecting a baby. And I'm very grateful for y'all, and I'm grateful for this podcast.
Yeah. Love you guys.
Now I'm crying.
I know, but I was so thankful. So.
All right. Bye, you guys. We'll talk again in a couple weeks.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by TJ Hester. And if you like what you've heard, please drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating or review. Until next time.